In 1939, Pennsylvania Railroad unveiled a 140-foot streamlined locomotive, so massive and advanced, it was meant to render future giants like the Big Boy obsolete before they even existed. Costing a staggering $669,780 and boasting more horsepower than anything else on rails, the S1 was supposed to change history. Why did a machine built to end the age of giants disappear almost before its reign began? The answer starts in a blaze of the World's Fair spectacle. April 1939. Crowds pressed against the railings at the New York World's Fair, drawn not just by the promise of the future, but by the gleam of something utterly alien to the age of steam. Towering above the throng, the Pennsylvania Railroad S1 stretched longer than a city block, its body wrapped in seamless metal curves that shimmered beneath the spring sun. Newspapers called it the Queen of the Fair. Children craned their necks to glimpse the nose, a bullet-shaped prow that seemed to slice the air even at rest. The S1 was not just a locomotive, it was a spectacle, a statement, and a gamble all at once. Raymond Loewy, already a household name for his streamlined designs, had sculpted the S1 as an icon of American ambition. He patented every contour, every hidden seam, every Art Deco flourish. The locomotive's skin was more than sheet metal. It was a promise that speed and style could be engineered into a single, unstoppable force. The press swarmed Loewy for interviews, eager for quotes about the future of travel. He stood beside his creation, immaculate in a tailored suit, answering questions about aerodynamics and the American spirit. Photographers angled for shots that would make the S1 look even bigger, even faster, even more inevitable. The cost was staggering. $669,780 for a single prototype, a sum that could have bought an entire fleet of conventional engines. But the S1 was never meant to be ordinary. Its sheer size, 140 feet 2.5 inches from coupler to coupler, forced the Pennsylvania Railroad to rethink what was possible. The locomotive arrived at the fairgrounds after a careful journey, its length challenging every curve and switch along the way. Once in place, it became the centerpiece, the Pennsylvania Railroad exhibit, drawing visitors from across the country. Newspapers ran headlines, "Largest locomotive in the world unveiled," and streamlined Marvel debuts at World's Fair. For a moment, the S1 was the star of American engineering, a vision of the future gleaming beneath the banners and spotlights. It was a machine that seemed to promise not just speed, but a new era, one where power and beauty would travel the rails side by side. The spectacle was undeniable. But behind the polished steel and the fanfare, the real test still waited. The world had seen the dream. The question was whether the dream could survive the rails. On the drawing boards at Altoona, the S1's numbers looked almost supernatural: 6,100 horsepower, nearly double what most mainline steam engines could muster at the time. Each of its driving wheels measured 84 inches across, a size chosen for one reason: speed. With wheels that large, a single rotation covered nearly 22 feet of track. At 100 miles per hour, those wheels spun almost 7 times every second. A blur of steel and momentum. The Pennsylvania Railroad's own press releases boasted that the S1 could pull a passenger train weighing 1,200 tons at 100 miles per hour, a feat no American locomotive had reliably achieved in regular service. Test sheets from the builder listed a tractive effort of 76,400 pounds, promising effortless acceleration even with a string of heavyweight Pullmans behind. The S1's boiler dwarfed anything else on the rails, 300 pounds of pressure pushing through a direct heating surface of 660 square feet, with over 2,000 square feet in its superheater. Steam flow calculations showed nearly 18,000 cubic feet per minute at full throttle, enough to keep both sets of cylinders fed even at top speed. The design called for 2 pairs of cylinders, each driving its own set of 4 drivers, all mounted on a single rigid frame. In theory, this duplex arrangement would deliver the brute force of an articulated engine, but with less mechanical complexity and more stability at speed. Every detail on the spec sheet suggested a machine built to rewrite the rules. The S1 was not just another step in locomotive evolution. It was a leap, a prototype meant to outclass not only Pennsylvania Railroad's own K4s and M1s, but also any rival's future ambitions. Union Pacific's Big Boy was still 2 years from steaming out of Alco's shops, yet the S1's projected performance already made it look conservative by comparison. Pennsylvania Railroad's gamble was clear. If the S1 worked as promised, it would make entire fleets of older engines obsolete overnight. But even as the technical teams at Altoona pored over blueprints and builders' sheets, the S1 remained a one-off. No production orders followed the prototype. The railroad staked its hopes on a single machine, convinced that the numbers alone would justify the risk. The question now was whether those numbers could survive the reality of steel rails and daily service. Inside the Altoona drawing office, engineers wrestled with a challenge that had never been attempted on this scale. The S1's duplex drive was more than a new arrangement of cylinders. It was 2 separate engines, each with its own pair of cylinders and 4 massive 84-inch driving wheels, locked together on a single, unyielding steel spine. Instead of the familiar articulated hinge found on giants like the Mallet or the Union Pacific Big Boy, the S1's power plant ran the entire length of the locomotive as a rigid, uninterrupted frame. This was the core of the duplex idea. Split the work of moving a train between 2 engines, but keep everything perfectly aligned for high-speed stability. In theory, this avoided the mechanical headaches of hinges, pivots, and flexible steam pipes. In practice, it created a machine nearly 78 feet from pilot to cab, with a total length, locomotive and tender, stretching 140 feet and 2.5 inches. The wheel arrangement, classified as 6446, told its own story. 6 wheels led the way, followed by 2 sets of 4 drivers, each driven by its own engine unit, and 6 trailing wheels to support the boiler's enormous weight. The rigid frame was a marvel of casting. 97,620 pounds of steel poured in a single piece by General Steel Castings, the largest locomotive bed ever attempted. This design promised a smoother ride at high speed and a direct transfer of power to the rails. But it came at a cost. Every foot added to the wheelbase made the locomotive less able to handle the curves, switches, and turntables that dotted the American rail system. Railroads in the 1930s had been built to accommodate engines half the S1's length. Standard mainline curves ranged from 2 to 3 degrees, tight enough to twist the frames of lesser engines, but just manageable for the K4s and M1s that had come before. The S1's rigid wheelbase, with its 2 driving sets locked in line, demanded curves far gentler than most of the PRR network could offer. Engineering diagrams from the period show the S1's frame overlaying typical track plans. On paper, the overhang at each end threatened to push the wheels off the rails at anything sharper than a sweeping mainline bend. The leading and trailing trucks had just over 2 inches of lateral play, but it was not enough. On test runs, the S1 sailed through the straightaways, but every curve became a negotiation with physics. The practical result was a locomotive that could only operate on the broadest, straightest stretches of track. The Chicago to Crestline corridor, with its long, flat runs across the Midwest, became the S1's entire world. Even there, the massive engine strained the limits of the infrastructure. Standard turntables, built for engines up to 110 feet, were dwarfed by the S1's frame. At Crestline, the roundhouse crews had to devise special maneuvers just to turn the engine for its return trip. On wires and tight switches, derailments were a constant risk. The S1's sheer size made it a stranger on its own railroad, unable to venture east toward Pittsburgh or navigate the iconic horseshoe curve. For the engineers at Altoona, the duplex was supposed to be the answer to the articulated giants out west, a machine that could deliver the same brute power without the complexity of a jointed frame. But the cost of this elegance was a dependence on infrastructure that simply did not exist. Every specification, every drawing, every calculation came back to the same problem. Without a network built to its scale, the S1's promise of revolution would remain confined to a single, straight ribbon of track. The dream of two engines working in perfect harmony had become a reality of one giant, struggling to fit the world around it. Steam poured from the S1's stack as it thundered across the flat prairies of Indiana. But beneath that spectacle, trouble brewed in ways no blueprint could predict. The duplex drive, meant to tame the raw force of 6,100 horsepower, instead unleashed a problem crews would soon dread wheel slip. On paper, the S1's 84-inch drivers promised unmatched speed and stability. In practice, those same wheels struggled for grip, especially when the train's weight shifted or the rails turned slick with rain or dew. Inside the cab, engineers strained to detect the first signs of trouble. Unlike most steam engines, where a slipping wheel set announced itself with a shriek or a sudden jolt, the S1 masked its own distress. Both sets of cylinders exhausted steam into a single stack, blending the sound of power and failure into one steady roar. When the front engine lost adhesion, there was no warning. Only when the train slowed, or when metal began to tear itself apart, did the crew realize what had happened. Test logs from 1940 describe the process in clinical detail. Sudden slip at speed, power cut, train halted, and a long, anxious inspection trackside. The problem was more than a nuisance. Each time the wheels spun without traction, the steel tires suffered severe wear, and the pounding stresses risked damage to rods and cranks. The S1's sanding system, designed to lay a protective layer of grit in front of the wheels, only reached the leading drivers. The rear set, just as prone to slip, was left to fend for itself. Crews tried improvising, sometimes stopping mid-run to apply sand by hand, but the sheer size and shrouded skirting made even this a challenge. In the shops at Crestline and Fort Wayne, the S1 became notorious for the work it generated. Standard maintenance routines broke down in the face of the duplex's complexity. The rigid frame, with its two separate engines locked in step, required custom tools for nearly every job. Routine repairs, changing a tire, resetting rods, and aligning valve gear became multi-day projects, often with parts that had to be fabricated from scratch. Shop correspondence from the period hints at frustration, requests for special jigs, notes about delays, and warnings that the S1 could tie up an entire bay for weeks. Every hour spent wrestling with the S1's machinery meant another train delayed, another crew idled, another cost added to the ledger. The locomotive's promise of power and speed was undercut by the reality of downtime and expense. For the Pennsylvania Railroad's mechanical department, the S1 was both a marvel and a burden, a machine that demanded the best from its operators and gave little forgiveness in return. The question now facing the railroad's leadership was no longer just about innovation, but about survival. How much longer could they afford to keep the dream alive? By the late 1940s, the Pennsylvania Railroad boardroom no longer echoed with talk of streamlined futures or revolutionary duplexes. Instead, the agenda was dominated by numbers, maintenance logs, fuel costs, and the relentless rise of diesel-electric locomotives across the industry. Minutes from PRR finance meetings in 1946 paint a clear picture. The S1's mounting repair bills and its chronic downtime made further investment impossible to justify, While the S1 sat idle in the Crestline shops, diesel units were logging thousands of trouble-free miles on routes the giant duplex could never touch. Across the country, railroads were retiring steam fleets at a pace no one had imagined a decade earlier. In 1946 alone, American railroads purchased more than 1,200 new diesel locomotives, a figure that dwarfed the total number of experimental steam engines ever built. PRR's own diesel roster grew rapidly, each new unit capable of running anywhere on the system without the need for special turntables, reprofiled curves, or custom shop tools. The S1, once the pride of the fleet, now appeared on internal rosters as a costly anomaly. Too large for most lines, too delicate for routine service, and too complex for the realities of post-war railroading. The decision to withdraw the S1 from active service came quietly. There was no press release, no ceremony. Only a line in the 1946 equipment report noted its removal. For 3 years, it lingered in storage, a silent testament to a bet that had not paid off. By 1949, with dieselization nearly complete and the last of the great steamers being cut up for scrap, the S1 was dismantled without public notice. The world's largest steam locomotive, once hailed as the future, was gone, its promise erased by a tide of technology it could not outrun. Rail historians often return to the S1 not just for its size, but for the question it leaves behind. What if the experiment had worked? In the late 1930s, the S1 promised a new path for American steam, a rigid, streamlined powerhouse that could have made articulated giants like Union Pacific's Big Boy seem unnecessary before they ever hit the rails. On paper, the S1's duplex drive and 6,100 horsepower offered a blueprint for the next generation. Engineers at the time speculated that had the S1's balance of speed and power been matched by infrastructure willing to accommodate its length, the entire industry might have followed the Pennsylvania Railroad's lead. Instead of a nation dominated by articulated steam and then diesels, the rigid duplex might have become the standard for mainline passenger power. Yet the lesson that endures is not just about technology. Innovation, no matter how bold, cannot escape the limits of its environment. The locomotive's rigid frame demanded a network that didn't exist, and no amount of horsepower could compensate for curves and turntables that refused to yield. For every engineer who admired the S1's ambition, there was a shop foreman or a track supervisor wrestling with the reality of fitting a 140-foot machine onto a system built for engines half its size. Some railroad historians see the S1 as a cautionary tale, a warning that the most advanced solution is useless if the world isn't ready to receive it. Others point to the influence it had on later duplex experiments, like the Pennsylvania Railroad T1, and on the broader debate over whether to pursue speed, power, or versatility. In the end, the S1's legacy is as much about the questions it raised as the records it set. What if the infrastructure had matched the ambition? What if the future had arrived just a little sooner, or the old ways lingered a little longer? The S1 remains a monument to a moment when American railroading stood at a crossroads and chose a different path. Today, rail innovation moves at breakneck speed, but the S1's fate warns that vision alone is not enough. Technology that outpaces its world risks vanishing before it ever reshapes it. For every breakthrough, infrastructure and timing still decide what survives. In the race to the future, the boldest ideas can become the quietest disappearances. What is your take on lost innovations? Share your thoughts below.